It was on December 6th, 1904, that the life of David Stone Libbey came to an untimely end. David was a river driver, a Civil War soldier. He was a miner out in Utah and Nevada for a time. But on December 6th, he was hunting outside of Chester, Maine in the woods near his deer camp with his friends and his son, but he didn't come home that night. And to learn about David, we have to go back throughout the 1800s to learn about his life and the legacy he left through his writings and his studies of nature and wildlife and what he wrote about under his pen name, Penobscot. So in this episode of My Maine Matters, we're exploring the life and legacy of pioneer David Stone Libbey. So come on, let's go explore. Now, if you've heard or read about Maine lumbermen and river drivers, you may have certain stereotypical images in your mind. Certainly when people see a picture of Paul Bunyan, it conjures up certain thoughts of what lumbermen were like, both in the woods and in the cities. And Paul Bunyan wasn't the only image or figure that drove some stereotypes of Maine lumbermen. And Maine's Holman F. Day, poet, novelist, newspaperman, wrote lots of ballads about the woods and the people that worked in them. One of his famous ballads is titled O'Connor of the Drive. You could hear him when he started from the Ripogenus shoots, Ripogenus being Day's term for the Ripogenus Gorge up north of Moosehead. John Ross was a famous lumberman who commanded the west branch of the Penobscot River for the river drives for many years in the 1800s. He was loved by his men, but he was one tough lumber boss. You could hear the crunching cranching of his swashing spike-soled boots. You could even hear the colors in the flannel shirt he wore, and the forest fairly shivered at the way O'Connor swore. Those mountains in the background there are the Moose Hills, or what you might know as the Spencer Mountains, but really named Cocodjo and Sabatawan. 'Twas averred that in the city full 100 miles away, they felt a little tremor when O'Connor drew his pay. That photo there is from Fanny Hardy Eckstorm, from her side of the river in Brewer, looking over towards Bangor, and you could see a bunch of lumber there. Though he drew it miles away, when O'Connor drew his pay, the people in the city felt the shock of it that day. And they said in deepest gloom, the drive is in the boom, and O'Connor's drawn his wages, clear the track, and give him room. O'Connor reached the city, and he reached it with a jar. He had piled up all the cushions in the center of the car. He had set them all on fire, and around the blazing pile, he was dancing dingo breakdowns in a very jovial style. And before they got him cornered, they had rung in 3 alarms, and it took the whole department to tie his legs and arms. He had spent his last lone copper, but they sold his spike-soled boots for enough to pay his freightage back to Ripogenus shoots. Fanny Hardy Eckstorm tells a great story about spike-soled boots in her book, The Unpublished Stories and Essays. They put him in a crate and they shipped him back by freight to commence his year of chopping up in Township number 8. And earnestly he swore when they dumped him on the shore, he had never spent his wages quite so pleasurably before. That there is part of the ballad from O'Connor of the Drive by Holman F. Day. In her book, The Penobscot Man, Fanny Hardy Eckstorm mentioned Holman F. Day, but she was writing true stories of the people that she heard stories about from her father and the woodsman when she was out in the woods, and they told stories, or when she was just there on the drive with them. And she tried to make sure she captured the true-to-life images of those men. And she got very upset at some of the reviewers in the paper who wrote about her book as if it was fiction or that she was giving them too much of a high praise. In the paper in 1904, a Boston reviewer wrote, "It is doubtful also if the citizens of Bangor, where the Penobscot man spends his holidays and money, would give him as good a recommendation as the author." Fanny was very upset at that, and she wrote in a future edition of the book, "Just here the Lord delivered this Philistine into my hands. If anyone knew what the river driver did with his time and money when in Bangor, it was those of us who lived in Brewer, where I was born and brought up. No one from Brewer in those days before electric cars, not your Teslas, but the trolleys, went to any part of Bangor without going through either the Exchange Street Tenderloin or the Devil's Half-Acre. We had to see all the worst of it. As a schoolgirl going every day through one or the other of these waterfront districts, I had to pass through the midst of the crowds of woodsmen who at certain seasons thronged those parts. That she wrote in 1926 in her second edition. And in the annotated edition, The Penobscot Man, Life and Death on a Maine River, I've included Fanny's appendix from the 1926 edition, as well as a lot of pictures and stories that were not included in the original edition, and some unpublished works of Fanny's that tell about how her life was threatened the time she went up to document these stories at Ripogenus. Very fascinating story. That there is a picture of Fanny Hardy Eckstorm's home in Brewer. It's got a placard on the front because it's a historical building in town. She lived there from 1899 until her death in 1946. In the garden in the back, in Brewer, there stands a statue of the patron saint of ecology, St. Francis, holding a bird. Fanny Hardy wrote the Bird Book and the Woodpeckers. She founded the chapter, or co-founded the chapter of the Audubon chapter at Smith College. She also wrote a lot of essays that are in the book Katahdin, Pomola, and Whiskey Jack about birds. Her father made sure Fanny grew up knowing the Maine woods. He would take her on multi-week trips down the east branch of the Penobscot, down the west branch to the Machias Lakes, and one of their excursions is told in the book Exploring the Maine Woods, where not only was he taking her through the Machias Lakes to learn about that part of the Maine woods, but also they were looking for poachers. Fanny was working on a series of articles on poachers and game laws and the crimes that were being committed. Both her and her father were proponents of the game laws, and they were upset about what was going on, and she went there to find the true story. So there's some hidden messages in that book about that. And the full essays of her game law essays, which are phenomenal, make great reading, are told in Fanny Hardy Eckstorm Short Stories and Essays, which have some unpublished stories in here. And this is the book that has the story also about the spike sole boots. Fanny was also a photographer of sorts. When they took some of their trips, she brought along her glass plate camera, which was not easy in those days, of course, because they were lugging across carries and putting the stuff in canoes. And this is a photo she took in Greenville about 1891, and she noted this was downtown at high water. So during their excursions on the rivers and in the woods of Maine, Fanny met a lot of the woodsmen and river drivers and lumbermen. And it was important for her when she was writing to put down their true character. But what type of character was river driver and lumberman David Stone Libbey? Fanny knew him well, as did Manly Hardy. Was he an O'Connor, as characterized by Holman Day? Was he a Paul Bunyan of the stories? Was he a John Ross, a very tough lumberman? Probably the best view into David was from his own writing, and this is a poem he wrote entitled, "It is October." When frosty nights succeed the sunny days, and hunters range the gleaming forests over, and round the mountain hangs a purple haze, it is October. When anglers lay their rods and baskets by, pack leaders, reels, and flies with faces sober, and lock them up with many a wistful sigh, it is October. When partridges steal softly from the woods at eve to seek their food amid the clover, and in the sunny glades the woodcock broods, it is October. When timid does put on their coats of blue, and antlered bucks forsake the thicket cover, to roam with listening ears the forest through, it is October. When forests burn in crimson golden dun, and hounds with mellowed throats track woodlands over, when round the lakes is heard the booming gun, it is October. That there is first Roach Pond up in Cocodjo, Maine. There's first, second, third, fourth Roach Ponds up that way. And did you know they once renamed those ponds to Cocodjo and the Roach River to Cocodjo River? And Fanny Hardy Eckstorm set the state straight with why they couldn't do that, and they changed all the maps and documents back to Roach Pond and Roach River. You can read that story in Katahdin, Pomola, and Whiskey Jack. David published his poem "It is October" in Forest and Stream in 1882, and he signed it Penobscot. He always signed his writings, whether it was an article or an essay under his pen name, Penobscot. And why he did that has to do with who he was and where he came from. But who was he? Well, he was a husband and a father and a hunter and a woodsman, a river driver, a lumberman, a digger of ship knees, a naturalist, a boatman, a farmer, a singer, a store clerk, a miner, a carpenter, a writer, and even a poet. David wrote under the pen name Penobscot because he was from Penobscot County, and he lumbered on and drove logs on the Penobscot Rivers. Penobscot County is the fourth largest county in Maine. It extends south of Bangor all the way up to the east, but northwards past Katahdin. It's a very long county. And so you can see it went from what was the most populous city in the state at the time, it was the lumber capital, all the way up into the great woods where pretty much nobody was living at the time. David grew up in Greenbush, Edinburgh, Howland area where his family first settled. Later in life, around 1870-71, they moved to Newport-Maine, and he lived there for the rest of his life, and his children lived there subsequently. He is included in the Libby Family in America volumes. Now, Charles T. Libby in 1882 started this family genealogy, and at the time he estimated that from John Libby, who came to the New World in the 1600s, by the 1800s there were 200 or 300,000 descendants. So you can imagine this volume 1 that Charles put together, which is an immense volume of genealogy and has some amazing detail of what he did to get that genealogy in the day of the postal service back then and gathering that information. David, for the book, submitted his portrait, and he signed it Libbey, and many different spellings exist for the Libby name, and that's all explained in volume 1 of Charles T. Libby's book. In 1907, 3 years after David Libby passed away, Fanny Hardy Eckstorm published this book, David Libby, Penobscot Woodsman and River Driver. It's a very tiny book based on David's journals. It's very rare now to find an original copy. And so the new book, David Libby, He Was Penobscot, includes all of this book plus David's original writings and some other additional stories that we found on David. But she wrote this book, and it was in a true American type series because she wanted to continue to tell the story that not everybody was part of those stereotypes of the lumberman and river driver. And so she wrote this based upon David's journal with permission from his family to get David's story out because he was a very unique river driver and lumberman, which we'll see. And she wrote, so far as I could observe, river driving did not breed a type. The hunter was a type, you could tell him at a glance. The lumberman was a type, he was easy to distinguish. But I cannot recall, she said, that after he had shed his particular clothes, the river driver was a marked man. It was the life they lived the rest of the year, rather than the few weeks on the drive, that classed them as types. With most of them, river driving was a metamorphosis, rather than a profession. Of course, river driving was only done several weeks of the year, April, May, June. By July 4th, it was pretty much over back then in the mid-1800s because there were no large concrete dams. They had some crib dams to hold back some head of water, but for the most part, they were counting on the spring freshet and the melt from the winter to drive those logs down over the rapids and the pitches and the falls all the way to the booms in Bangor and Old Town along the main branch of the Penobscot. She said the more reckless either died young or reformed, the more intelligent and ambitious worked into other occupations and became head boatmen, head lumbermen, mill owners, or landowners. David Libby actually wrote a note for the Bangor paper about the book, The Penobscot Man, after it first came out, and he wrote, the old Penobscot river drivers to whom this book most strongly appeals do not as a class haunt bookstalls. To the writer who knew personally almost every character mentioned in it, it possesses a greater interest than any book he ever read. And that review that Fanny got from David was certainly one of her favorite, well more cherished and valued than any of the ones that were published in the papers, particularly those that were not understanding that this was a book about real men and that David knew a lot of these men, as well did Fanny, from interviewing them or hearing stories of them from people who knew them. She was documenting real life stories in that book, and that was extremely important to her that people understood that. The second key point about this quote from David is that he says it possesses a greater interest than any book he ever read. The last part of David's statement there is very important, because he did not have a lot of formal schooling, but he was very well read. Eckstorm, for her part, wrote of Libby, "He was one of Maine's thoroughbred woodsmen and watermen, one of the most notable of our hunters, who, going to San Francisco, took a place in a stationer's store and handled paper by the quire and arranged perfumery on the closet shelves. And from there to the deserts of Nevada, where he set up mining machinery and met Western badmen, and he, unarmed and unruffled, made them behave themselves." David's son Charles told Fanny years later that my father never went armed, not trusting his quick temper. Fanny wrote of David, "He was also known as a man of great literary gifts and varied attainments." But how did he attain all of this? Well, for that we have to go back to start this tale in 1828, the year of David's birth. The Libby home was the ordinary two-room log cabin of the pioneer. The children, all of them, slept in the spare room or in the loft above. The living room contained the bed of the parents, the loom, the spinning wheel, the shingled horse where David's father would form the shingles from the cedar logs that were cut, the cradle, the dining table, and all the pots and pans and everything else the family owned. He was the son of Asa and Abigail Libby, born August 22nd, in that log house by the river's bank. His parents, Asa and Abigail, were married in December of 1815. Asa was 29, Abigail was 18. They first lived in Edinburgh on the west bank of the Penobscot River, and then in the adjoining towns of Howland and Greenbush for a while. David was a child of pioneers with 6 generations of pioneers behind him, stemming from John Libby, who settled in Scarborough, Black Point, Maine. The pioneering spirit in this family took 2 of the daughters, Mary and Emma, to San Francisco, where they became some of the first school teachers out west. David didn't attend much formal schooling. That wasn't uncommon back then. Schools were fairly infrequent. But how then did he become this writer, as the writer under the pen name Penobscot? Well, during the winter evenings, Asa would read aloud from various books: the Bible, Shakespeare, Longfellow, Tennyson, Byron, Browning, Holmes, and Scott. He could actually render verbatim many long cantos and selections from these books. And from this, David Libby acquired the style which marks his writings. For great models, Fanny said, are better than many masters. Charles, his son, remarked later, but in his later years, he was partial to Bret Harte and Kipling. In the evening, Asa would draw the fro across the cedar, and his sister Lydia would feed the fire with the shavings to give David light in order so he could do his mathematical sums. Now, Eckstorm visited the house of Charles Libby there in 1916, and she saw our cedar fro, and later on, when she was interviewed for some historical program, this is what she had to say about the fro.
But the tool with which they split shingles we called a fro.
Yes, that's a good one. I'm glad you mentioned it. They're pretty scarce.
They are scarce. The only one that I remember seeing, and that may have been thrown away by this time, was over in Newport, Mr. Libby's.
Oh, yeah.
They had froes.
Yes, I'm going there tomorrow.
Well, ask if they have any of those old tools, broadaxes and such things as that Mr. David Libby used when he was in the woods.
David probably had a typical Maine childhood. He surely helped with the chores and was likely given an axe at the young age. He tells a story of going down the Penobscot and the Piscataquis using pieces of driftwood, kind of an early paddleboard, where he probably learned some of his fancy footwork that was needed later when he was a river driver. He did a lot of fishing and hunting as a boy. Later in life, he recalled some of his early exploits, and you can get a sense for his development in his skill as a writer in this passage. In 1879, this was published in Forest and Stream. It has been a little more than 40 years since the writer, then a barefoot boy, drew his first trout, a 3-pounder, from the sparkling waters of the Seboois, just where it joins the Piscataquis. And what, O disciples of split bamboo, braided silk, invisible gut, and singing reels, do you suppose was the tackle used on that momentous occasion? A black alder pole, cut on the spot, to which was attached a discarded band from the busy spinning wheel, which was then found in almost every dwelling in the state. Fastened to this by a black linen gange was a small but coarse-wired and blunt-pointed hook with a side bend, which we called a curbed hook, being as near as we could get to Kirby, Kirby being the store-bought brand. I had caught a small chub with this primitive tackle, and with a small boy's cruelty, was amusing myself by spinning him through the water, when the tempting bait caught the hungry eye of a magnificent trout. With a lightning-like rush he gorged both fish and hook, and then commenced the tug-of-war. Ye gods, what a commotion was created in that quiet eddy by the desperate and futile struggles of the noble fish to escape from the cruel hook, and my equally vain and frantic efforts to lift him from his native element. Then he goes on, but I don't want to ruin the story for you. You can read that in the book. David was also a singer. He told Eckstorm, when a child, I had a phenomenal voice, and the river drivers used to hire me to sing. Many years later, Eckstorm would have a project where she would capture some of the ballads of the Maine woods. He was also a cookie, or the cook's assistant, at a lumber camp. He would run the tea out to the men who were on the chopping lot, or put together their lunches, or get the water ready for the potatoes and other chores. And one time he tells a story of where he heard the camp dog barking, and he wondered what the dog was barking at, and he thought maybe it was a partridge, a ruffed grouse, or a rabbit, something he could shoot to put into the pot for the men's lunch. So he took his bird shotgun and went out into the woods after the dog, and he came upon a blowdown that was covered over with some brush, and he knew there was only one animal smart enough to cover up the den with brush. But even as a boy, knowing this, he stuck that bird shotgun into that den. And when the bear jumped out, he jumped up in the air, he said, and back, and then began this pursuit of bear against boy and boy against bear. And throughout the chase, he actually examined the bear plug. Here is a boy of 13 or 14 making naturalist observations, so it's quite a story. But he vowed, if I ever reach camp with a whole skin, I'll become one of the most exemplary cooks on the river. In 1850, when he was 24 years old, he began his first journal. And on the right there, I've pasted some original writings of his that we've found, letters that were sent home to Maine, which was a remarkable discovery. And they're very brief records, usually 3 days to a page, and entries like this. January 8th, came very near losing what few brains I happened to possess. I don't know exactly what he did, we don't know. Then he wrote, I broke 2 axe handles and made 1, so much for working Sunday, so you can see kind of his humor. As a lumberman, David also dug chipneys, and for that you would dig the hackmatack or juniper, the entire tree's trunk and taproot out of the ground. July 5th, he wrote he went to Bangor to circus in the caravan and the theater. A person named Dudley gave him town's 4th grade reader, spelling book, Smith's Geography Atlas, and arithmetic books. July 12th, he began going to school. Note, he is now 24 years old, and from age 13 until 18, Eckstorm noted he didn't go to school at all. The young man, river driver, ox teamster, lumberman, and hunter, sat patiently on a cramped school bench through the heat of summer doing sums. Probably all his school days would not more than equal 3 modern school years. The commentary from Eckstorm on the Journal of 1857 was there was only one important event that entire year, and that was on March 23rd, went to town meeting, married this evening by Reverend William Dobble to M.A. Young. The note was so cryptic it didn't include Mary's full name, Mary Ann Young. They would have 3 children, Flora, Alice, and Charles. Throughout his early life, lumbering and hunting were his chief occupations. The moose and the deer they hunted for meat and skins. You can see from a work of the winter of 1859 and 60, he made $146. Essentially a couple $1,000 in today's dollars. Not much for 8 to 12 weeks of work, living in the deep snows of the Maine woods in a very rough log cabin from logs that they cut down at the campsite. 1860, there's very bare detail. June 17th, went over Island Rips. 19th, went over Gordon Rips. June 20th, went over Piscataquis Falls. The 21st, went over Passadumkeag Rips. The 23rd, went into Boom at Old Town and back home. July 5th, he buys Tennyson's poems, Worcester's Dictionary, Prince of the House of David. So he was a river driver that went to the bookstores. Of the year 1870, he wrote to Eckstorm, "Even then I had drove. That isn't good grammar, but it's good dialect. 25 seasons, handling boat, 15 of them." In 1870, he was 42, an age when most men turned away from the dangerous profession of driving logs, but he was still out on the rivers. She asked him about what his pay was. 1859, he was paid $1.25 a day, 1860, $2 a day, and 1870, $4.50 a day as a head boatman. The journal continues with very short entries. In 1864, got over the upper pitch of Jimskiticook, drove over Scatarack, cleared Gordon Falls of a middle jam, worked on a big jam below Slougunda. Slougunda was a place of many bad jams, and in 1846 Maine passed a law: no person shall put into the Mattawamkeag River or its tributary streams for the purpose of being run through the place called Slougunda any log, mast, or spar, or other timber exceeding 40 feet in length, because it would cause such a horrible jam. The 30th, he drove over Ledge Falls and threw his ankle out of joint. That picture there is at Ripogenus Gorge, taken by Fanny Hardy Eckstorm in 1891, when she took her camera up to the gorge and took pictures of the men to document the drive. June 1st, drove over Slougunda, 2nd, over Gordon Falls, and finally arrived home. Eckstorm said, "To the stranger, this list of rapids is but a roll of barbarous names, yet each one stands for 100 dangers, 1,000 difficulties." October of 1864, at 36 years old, David ships out for the Civil War. He's a private in Company D, 9th Maine. Interestingly, we found letters, the lost letters of David Libby, at an unlikely place, in the Duke University Library. They sent me a scanned copy of these, and they have all been transcribed and put into the new book. "Dear Mary, I didn't get anything to eat till dark, and then nothing but cold beef, and cold water, and hard bread, all the coffee being drank up before I got a chance to sit down." He still has a sense of humor, though. "I got a seat at the first table the next morning, and tried to drink it all up and away from the rest of them, and hope I succeeded." He writes to her that there are 3 rebel forts within a mile. They lost 40 men, killed. The nights were cold. They had to lay out in the open air without a fire. They were promised tents. David's letters continued. On October 31st, 1864, he wrote, "Dear Mary, I wrote you a line a day or 2 ago. I was so sick that I hardly knew what I wrote. I am all right now, although my hand trembles badly, and I walk like a drunken man, on account of my head being dizzy." The full letter goes on to explain what happened. There was a battle, and he was laying in a field, in the mud, during a cold rain. Shells exploded left and right, behind and in front of him. This badly damaged his hearing, but amazingly, he survived the battle. The entry for December 25th is very simple. Clubbed together and bought cabbage, which went nice for dinner. In the scanned letters, there's actually an envelope addressed to Mrs. David S. Libby, Suncays, Maine, which was the post office box at the time. Skipping ahead to April, heard of the surrender of Lee and all his army. Men cheered, drums beat, bands played. There was a great time all around. But the celebration was short-lived. Their soldiering was not over yet. By April 16th, they were out of provisions. He went foraging, shot a pig, got a canteen full of syrup and a piece of ham. But ever so observant, even in the midst of battle, starving, malnourished, very thin, he still had time to observe what was going on around him. A letter that David wrote home was printed in the magazine Flora, which was the newsletter of the Sarah P. Duke Gardens. It was published in the spring of 1995. Now, do you see the serendipitous connection? David's daughter was named Flora. But whoever found David's letters in 1995 at Duke University saw the strength of his writing and his observational skills. And this is what he wrote to Mary. "Dear Mary, oh Mary, don't laugh till you read the whole. I wish I could send you some roses, such glorious ones you never dreamed of, thousands and thousands of them. Acres and acres, I might say, and such roses. Damask roses, as big and as bright as peonies. Pale yellow roses, as big as your 2 hands. And bright golden yellow roses, not much bigger than marigolds. China roses, and climbing roses, and tea roses, and moss roses. Roses everywhere. The very air is heavy with their perfume. So this lumberman, river driver, soldier, ox teamster, market hunter writes about roses. He travels through the South seeing the estates and the gardens, and it must have been something for someone who grew up in a log cabin in the north woods of Maine. But it's not all roses. He writes home, some thief having stolen my knapsack with everything I had in it, overcoat, rubber blanket, shelter tent, drawers, shirts, and stockings, and what I valued more than all the rest, all my letters, along with Lewis's likeness. There were over 50, and I had carried them safely through all of our long and tedious marches. Thanks a lot. Hi there. Glad to see you're still here. That means you've been enjoying this content from my Maine Matters. And unlike PBS or Maine Public Broadcasting Network, I'll never ask you for any of your hard-earned tax dollars. But there is something you can do to help with this content. And that is, please share the video. If you would, click that share icon. Share it into your social media network or copy the link and share it with a couple of friends. It not only helps me distribute the video, but it helps you because then YouTube determines this is the kind of content you want to watch. So it's a win-win. You won't be signed up for a newsletter, you won't get any emails or cold calls. It's just a way to help YouTube algorithm learn about the videos you like. Oh, and one more thing. To become a Super Channel supporter, please leave a short comment, because that helps with the algorithm even more to share the video with those who might like it. Thanks a lot. June 1st, 1865, Raleigh, North Carolina. Dear Mary, the money you sent must be lost. It is just as well, however, for I have had my wallet stolen, and they would have got it all. As it was, they only got $1. He tells of there are 4 to 10 men a day dying. They are frightfully low on rations. Some days they have none. Many men lay in their tents just waiting to expire, and they do. However, David Libby goes on hikes, even though he is finding it hard to breathe, but he picks berries and plums to survive. On the 29th of June, 1865, David Libby was mustered out. By the 11th of July, he is home again. Once more, he plunges into the life he loves, fishing, hunting. He goes bee hunting. September 12th, he got 22 pounds. Got 75 on the 14th, but lost 25. Not sure how. The journal doesn't say. Sometimes there's a piling bee at some neighbors to clear land of timber. Sometimes they had entertainment. October 17th, his entry says they had a dance. Pratt played the same tune for 12 hours. But lumbering was in him. Soon after the war, he was back in the woods. 2 years later, May 11th, 1867, he was working near a roll dam. Well, David got knocked in by a log that struck his cant dog. He went over that dam and was carried to the bottom at the foot of the apron, severely bruising his left leg, arm, and side on the ledges. He swam over the pitch under the bridge and came out below. If any other man had been dragged down an apron of a roll dam, he may not have survived, but this was David Libby, and he had more lives than a bobcat. 1871, he was dressing knees. This is the process of taking timber you dig out of the ground and make them to the shipbuilder's specifications. His axe caught on a limb on the knee and came down on his left foot, cut off the end of his little toe and split the next one in 2 pieces, and his foot in for over an inch. He wrote Dr. D, doesn't give the full name, dressed it, and David paid him $1.50. The entry continued 7 days later. I sucked up all the adhesive plaster from my foot to see what made it smell so offensive. Found that the fool of a doctor had bound the piece cut off my little toe to the underside of my next toe. That's a picture of a ship knee after it has been formed to specifications, taken at the Maine Maritime Museum. In the fall of 1876, David Libby goes west. He went to visit his sisters Mary and Emma and their husbands, the Bonstell brothers, and his nephew Chesley. David's nephew, Chesley Knight Bonestell, would have a son, born nearly 10 years after David's visit. Chesley Knight Bonestell Jr. would become a well-known painter and illustrator. It is said his paintings of outer space and rockets inspired the American space program, and certainly the ideas of his imagination were influential in early science fiction writing. This is Bonestell's first cover for Galaxy Science Fiction magazine in February 1951. It was titled The Tying Down of a Spaceship on Mars in Desert Sandstorm. On the 18th of November, David Libby got his first sight of the Pacific. 2 days later, he entered the employment of J.G. Hodge and Company, a wholesale stationer's, as a receiving clerk. Now he has time to enjoy the city, and he writes of his San Francisco life. He went to the opera and the old folks' concert, writing they were very good and splendid. He then goes to see a play. The Old Homestead was a play about a New Hampshire country bumpkin who travels to the big city, not unlike David. David declared, "It was the best impersonation of Yankee character I ever saw." While he's living in San Francisco with his sisters, he has time in the evenings to write. And he reflects on the time he was in the Adirondacks, there digging ship knees years before. He writes on a time he saw poaching on the river. "How often have I seen a man, I suppose I must call him a man, with a string of trout, expatiating on the sport he had with such, before he succeeded in landing them. When his back was turned, someone would quietly remark, he caught them on a porterfly, the porterfly being of course the gill net strung across the river." He stated there are guides who greatly deplore it in the Adirondacks, and asked why they do not enforce the law, stated they would be burnt out of house and home or their lives endangered. Unfortunately, poaching still occurs on Maine rivers and streams, as proven by a recent story of a gill net found up on the McGalloway River up in the Rangeley area. That's a premier trout stream, once fished by the likes of David Stone Libbey and Cornelia Flyrod Crosby. Now David Libby, he was an avid fisherman, and he knew the importance of game conservation. And while he wrote about the poaching going on in the Adirondacks for the Saratoga hotels, he admitted the same was happening here in Maine, particularly in the Greenville area, and to supply the Mount Kineo house. And he had this to say about Big Wilson Stream. He wrote of Big Wilson Stream, "This magnificent stream, which in any other state would be called a river, flowing from a noble pond through a succession of wooded hills and mountains, fed by a multitude of sparkling brooks, clear as crystal, seems designed by nature as the very home of the beautiful and agile fish, which formerly populated its waters by thousands." In that 1876 article, David suggested salaried wardens. This was 15 years before Fanny Hardy would write her long series on the Maine game laws and the damage poachers were causing in the Maine woods. David once wrote, "If there is anything that I pride myself on above my skill as a still hunter, it is my entire and absolute truthfulness." And David wrote about Poacher Jack Russell, the man who in one winter butchered 75 moose for their hides alone, leaving their meat to pollute the air, still flourishes on the upper waters of the Passadumkeag. Fanny Hardy Eckstorm also wrote of Jack Russell, and how he once threatened to kill her. His memory deserves to be execrated more than him who burned the celebrated temple of antiquity. For destroyed temples can be rebuilt, but exterminated species cannot be recreated. He also wrote about Jock Darling, who was a sporting camp owner who hired out with dogs to hunt deer. He, Jock Darling, came out with a communication in a leading state paper deprecating the law which forbids deer hunting with dogs on the grounds that sportsmen left $20 in the state for every deer they took out. Jock Darling was known as an outlaw in the Maine woods. He was a poacher, a guide, sporting camp owner, and even a game warden for a time. You can read more about him in Exploring the Maine Woods. I Am Penobscot, the novel, includes the characters Jack Russell, Jock Darling, Fanny Hardy Eckstorm, and David Stone Libbey. When David departs to head home, he says goodbye to his sisters, but he does not take the train straight home. Instead, we don't know why, he stops in Nevada. There, he gets a job mining borax for boric acid. There was no drinking water for miles, no ranch within 8. There was nothing but coyotes in the desert, he says. Truly a God-forsaken hole. His home, much of the time, was in a dugout in the side of a natural mound. June 4th, still keeping a journal, he wrote, "Having lived for nearly a week without bread, Griffin, being unequal to the task of making it, I made a batch tonight. Having all along played ignorance of cooking, to avoid the responsibility, but he starved me out. So his time as a lumber camp cookie served him well. He concluded that Griffin was a dolt. He couldn't make boric acid no more than he could make bread. He finally ups and quits. He then gets work in a foundry. He makes flasks, pounds iron, mends wagons. He's a jack of all trades. He upholsters a sofa, papers rooms, does whatever he needs to, makes a pig pen, the circle for a buggy, window sashes, and so on. Eckstorm wrote, he now feels he is living sumptuously in an adobe hut lined with drilling to keep the dirt from sifting down. He could make patterns and castings for his own machinery. He set up machinery in a mine. He could manage and repair his own steam engines. He became very useful to the mine. 3 years and 6 months after leaving, he arrived back in Newport-Maine, March 20th, 1880. He is now 52 years old. Eckstorm said his sufficient success enabled him to make a handsome retreat back east. However, he had missed his daughter Flora's wedding, which occurred September 13th, 1879. Mary and the children are not the only ones glad to have Penobscot back in Maine. The editor of Forest and Stream wrote, we had a most pleasant call last week from Penobscot, whose frequent contributions to this journal have done so much to interest and instruct our readers. He proposes to take an extended trip through the Maine woods, and we are promised an account of the trip. Home once again, the woods become his pleasure ground. He never tires of them. And he was still writing. He was now too old to follow the river as a driver, so he turned again to getting out ship knees and ship timber. But his journals became fuller than ever. They were rich in materials. His observations of the woods and the animals were better trained. He was keener. His memory did not fail him. He accumulated treasures of woodlore. The editors wrote, Penobscot knows the Maine country as well as any man living, and what he may write will be sure to be intelligent and authentic. And write he did. He wrote on the habits of the ruffed grouse and autumn drumming. He talks of drumming logs, how they're selective to tree species, the male versus female behavior, and how they return to the same log year after year. Fortunately for the bird's preservation, the average American boy is not a very close observer of nature. His writing continues to be descriptive. In regard to their night drumming, I have observed that it takes place either in very dark, foggy, or drizzly nights, or in the brightest moonlight, as when the glorious harvest moon of October floods the forest glades with a radiance almost equal to the light of day. In those years, there were also not reputable articles being written, and David wrote, I have in fact an utter contempt for any person who willfully attempts to mislead in matters pertaining to natural history. While in San Francisco, he had gone to a traveling show. There, they had some models of animals on display. One, depicted as a moose, had its skin stretched to nearly twice its normal length. He wrote, the false ideas conveyed by that ridiculous display will be carried away by the readers to children and the children's children. He continued, it was no more related to a real moose than a greyhound related to an English bulldog. The placard had stated, a moose can trot at 17 miles per hour for 24 hours at a stretch. David continued his study of moose and deer, their habitat, their eating habits, and their breeding. His observation over 30 years from 1840 to the 1870s on litter size are consistent with biologist studies even today. He wrote about his observation of moose yards and their diet. He could easily tell what sex of moose inhabited an area. He wrote about the food in summer and the food in winter. During the coldest weather, he said they subsisted solely on the fine boughs of the evergreens, fir, cedar, and hemlock, with the first, fir, being their favorite. This taste for evergreens is a wise provision designed by Providence. His writing was not without humorous stories of things he saw in the woods. Once they were hunting far from camp way in the north woods. They had taken off their snowshoes to dress a moose. When they turned, their snowshoes were gone, as was a calf that had been in the area. However, the scariest moment to ever occur to him, he did not write more than 3 lines about it. David's internal woodsman sense of direction failed him only that one time. It was 1858, February. It was snowing hard. He wrote, got lost near the military road, crossed it, and did not know it. Kept on going west to Carlton Brook, very cold and windy, sat on a log, drowsed off. There the journal entries ended, but Eckstorm heard the rest of the story from brother-in-law James White. David's life was saved twice that night. First, when he was nearly exhausted, he sat down on that log to rest. He fell asleep, but his rifle, rolling from his knees, struck his feet. If that had not happened, he would have surely frozen to death sitting there. On getting stirred, he continued on and got to Matasunk Lake. There he found a camp that was deserted. There was no food, no fire. His own matches were useless. He was encased in ice. He sat down on the edge of the bunk. James reported David had resigned himself to fate, which was not far off, when, falling back from his exhaustion, he struck upon an old spread. The spread smelt of mice, but he knew he had to keep warm to stay alive. He wrapped himself in the spread. In the morning, with his last bit of energy, he continued on. At last, he stumbled in through the door of a trapper cabin. And there, the rest of the story is told in his book. So who was this man named Penobscot? Was he an O'Connor, a Paul Bunyan, a John Ross? His friends said he was a quiet man of cheery disposition who won friends on sight. He was alert, observant, receptive, rather than expansive. Not only honest, but honorable. Any difficulty made him even more determined. He was loyal to his friends, and he hated a liar as much as he hated a thief. His daughter said bolts and bars were a thing unknown to him. He never locked the doors of his house at night. He was utterly fearless as to harm coming to him, and he never harmed a human being. On December 6, 1904, outside the town of Chester, at their deer camp, David was hunting with his son Charles, a grandson, and his friend Mr. E.A. Weatherby. Each one went out alone to track deer. That night, David did not return. They fired signal shots, as was the norm. They searched the immediate area, but darkness required they wait until daylight. In the morning, they found him. A light snow had spread a thin blanket over him. He lay as one asleep. His rifle was carefully protected by his coat. He lay close beside the track of the deer he was following. Forest and Stream reported later that month, Mr. Libby, who had reached the age of 76, was one of the most experienced and most skillful hunters in Maine, and one whose vast information in the field of woodcraft was most highly respected by all who were conversant with it. As a writer over the signature of Penobscot, he was for many years a valued contributor to this journal. There was perhaps in the entire state of Maine no one who in the wilderness was more cautious than he, more circumspect to avoid danger, or better fitted to take care of himself in any ordinary emergency. However, this was not an ordinary emergency. December 23, 1904, the Maine Woods reported mysteries surrounding Libby's death solved. It was determined that a boy, 17 years old, had been tracking a deer, and when he heard David Libby walking, he fired. One of the ballads David Libby surely either sung or heard while he was on the drive was The Logger's Boast. In 1938, Alan Lomax made audio recordings of some of the old ballads. And this is sung by Lester Wells, a cappella, as it would have been on the river.
When our youthful days are ended and our stories are going on, we'll take to us each man a wife and settle upon the farm. We'll have enough to eat and drink, contented we will go. We will tell our wives of our hard times, and no more a lumbering go, and no more a lumbering go. We will tell our wives of our hard times, and no more a lumbering go.
Thanks for watching this episode of My Maine Matters about Maynard, Civil War soldier, river driver, lumberman, David Stone Libbey. We could only cover a short amount of his life in this video. Maybe someday someone will make a full movie about David. For now, check out those books. And I'll see you on the next episode of My Maine Matters. To learn more not only about David Libby, but Fanny Hardy Eckstorm, the Poacher Jack Russell, and Jock Darling, Big Seboois Mitchell, check out these books, The Penobscot Man, Life and Death on a Maine River, with never before published information. David Stone Libbey, he was Penobscot, his journals and his articles. I Am Penobscot, all about the writer under the pen name Penobscot. And Fanny Hardy Eckstorm, short stories and essays, never before published stories from Eckstorm and her full series on the Maine game laws. Want to learn more about Maine, stories and legends, and about writers and authors and explorers? Follow me on YouTube at Tommy Carbone and My Maine Matters.
Thank you for watching. This episode is an abbreviated edition of a talk on Maine history from Maine author Tommy Carbone. The full talk about David Stone Libbey has been delivered live at Maine historical societies and outdoor organizations. If you would like to arrange for Tommy to speak at your event, his entertaining talks cover Maine history, the outdoors, and characters from Maine's past. Contact him through his website at tommycarbone.com. You can find his books on Amazon or request them wherever books are sold.